Before the flood, beings of impossible stature walked the earth, and every ancient culture remembers them. What were they, and why did God erase them? Genesis chapter 6 opens with one of Scripture's most cryptic passages. 4 verses before God decides to flood the earth, we encounter the Nephilim, figures so enigmatic that 3,000 years of scholarship has failed to resolve who or what they were. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. 26 words containing an entire cosmology. The Hebrew term Nephilim appears only twice in the Old Testament, here and centuries later when Israelite spies returned from Canaan, terrified by giants who made them feel like grasshoppers. The problem isn't just that giants existed in ancient texts. The problem is their origin story involves sons of God taking human wives and producing offspring so extraordinary that their existence seems to have triggered divine judgment. This isn't mythology relegated to footnotes. This is canonical scripture, positioned deliberately as context for humanity's greatest cataclysm. Who were the sons of God? Were they fallen angels, as the Book of Enoch suggests? Were they Seth's righteous descendants intermarrying with Cain's corrupt line? Were the Nephilim actual giants, or does the term signify something else? Tyrants, warriors, those who fell upon others in violence? The text refuses easy answers. The Septuagint translates Nephilim as gigantes. The Vulgate agrees, but the Hebrew root nephal means to fall. Fallen from what? From where? The ambiguity is maddening because the consequences were absolute. Whatever the Nephilim represented, their presence coincided with humanity's corruption, reaching such depths that God regretted making mankind at all. And then there's the archaeological silence. If beings of massive stature once walked the earth, where are their remains? Where is the physical evidence that would silence skeptics and confirm what ancient texts consistently report? Understanding the Nephilim isn't ancient trivia. It's foundational to interpreting the Genesis narrative, the theological framework of the flood, and divine-human interaction in the antediluvian world. If the sons of God were angelic beings, this passage represents the most explicit biblical description of cosmic rebellion beyond Eden, a second great transgression that polluted not just human hearts, but human bloodlines. The New Testament authors thought this significant enough to reference directly. Jude quotes the Book of Enoch. Peter writes of angels who sinned and were cast into Tartarus. These weren't peripheral figures making casual allusions. These were apostles anchoring theological arguments on pre-flood realities. If the sons of God were human, the passage still illuminates how genetic and cultural corruption spread so thoroughly that only 8 people remained worth saving. Either interpretation reveals how completely humanity had fallen, but the mechanisms differ radically. The Nephilim also matter because they didn't vanish with the flood. Numbers 13 places giants in Canaan centuries later. Og, king of Bashan, required a 13-foot iron bed. Goliath stood over 9 feet tall. The conquest repeatedly involves eliminating giant clans, the Anakim, the Rephaim, the Emim. If these accounts are historical, the Israelites encountered remnants of something that survived from before the deluge. This creates theological challenge and archaeological question simultaneously. Theologically, if angelic-human hybridization occurred once, could it occur again? Was the Canaanite conquest partially about eliminating genetic corruption before it spread? Archaeologically, should we expect evidence of unusually large skeletal remains? And if found, how should they be interpreted? For modern readers, the Nephilim narrative frames questions about human origins, the limits of naturalistic explanations for ancient mysteries, and how seriously we take Scripture's stranger elements. This isn't peripheral material we can ignore. It's woven into covenant history, prophetic literature, and apostolic teaching. The passage arrives without warning. Genesis 5 concludes with Noah at 500 years old, then immediately shifts to this cryptic preamble. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. The phrase sons of God, B'nai Elohim in Hebrew, appears 5 times in the Old Testament. In Job, it unambiguously refers to angelic beings who present themselves before God. Job 1:6 and 2:1 use identical terminology. Job 38.7 describes the sons of God shouting for joy at creation's dawn, clearly not humans, as humans didn't yet exist. This linguistic consistency is difficult to dismiss. The daughters of men, but not Adam, provides a contrast. Adam is the generic term for humanity. The construction suggests 2 different categories of beings, not merely 2 human family lines. Then comes the divine response in verse 3. My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. God sets a countdown. Whether this means 120 years until the flood or a reduction in human lifespan remains debated, but the timing is catastrophic either way. Verse 4 crystallizes the crisis. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. The Nephilim existed during this cohabitation and afterward. The offspring, these mighty men, or Gibberim, became legendary. But the text doesn't clearly identify whether the Nephilim are the same as the Gibberim or represent a separate category. The grammatical ambiguity has fueled millennia of interpretation. The earliest Jewish readers understood this as describing fallen angels. The Book of Enoch, dated to around 300 BCE, provides extensive detail that it claims was passed down from antediluvian times. It names the angels, Azazel, Semjaza, and 200 watchers who descended to Mount Hermon, took an oath, and descended to take human wives. Enoch describes how these angels taught humans forbidden knowledge, metallurgy, cosmetics, astrology, weaponry. Their offspring were giants 3,000 cubits high who consumed all human resources, then turned to devouring humans themselves. This interpretation explains both the corruption and the violence that precipitated the flood. The New Testament lends this interpretation credibility. Jude 6 references angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, whom God has reserved in chains. 2 Peter 2:4 speaks of God casting angels who sinned into Tartarus. While these passages don't explicitly name Genesis 6, the early church fathers, including Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, and Tertullian, unanimously connected them to the sons of God taking wives. The logic flows naturally. If spiritual beings could manifest physically, as angels do throughout Scripture when they eat with Abraham or wrestle with Jacob, why couldn't they procreate? If Satan could indwell a serpent in Eden, why couldn't angels inhabit human form more fully? This interpretation also explains the severity of God's response. Genetic corruption of humanity's bloodline would constitute an assault on God's image-bearing creation and potentially threaten the coming Messiah's pure human lineage. The flood becomes not arbitrary divine anger, but necessary purification of corrupted DNA. Around the 4th century, Augustine popularized an alternative. The sons of God were Seth's righteous descendants, and the daughters of men were Cain's corrupt line. Intermarriage between these groups broke down the last barrier against universal wickedness. This view appeals to those uncomfortable with angelic procreation. It maintains human agency in the fall and avoids supernatural elements that raise difficult questions. The interpretation traces through Genesis 5's lineage from Seth, viewing this godly line as sons of God through covenant relationship. However, this view struggles with Bene Elohim. Nowhere else does this phrase mean human believers. It strains credibility that offspring of two human family lines would produce the legendary Gibborim, or explain why God would respond with global cataclysm. Humans had been sinning since Cain murdered Abel. Why would intermarriage suddenly trigger apocalypse? The Sethite view also doesn't adequately explain Nephilim, if this simply means violent men. Why use such a unique term that appears nowhere else until the Canaanite giants? Why would Numbers 13 use the identical word for beings that terrified experienced warriors? Some scholars propose sons of God refers to human rulers or kings who viewed themselves as divine. Ancient Near Eastern texts frequently describe kings as gods or sons of gods. Perhaps powerful despots were taking multiple wives, establishing harems, and their offspring became the mighty warriors of renown. This reading emphasizes political corruption rather than supernatural rebellion. The Nephilim become oppressors, those who fell upon others, predatory rulers whose violence filled the earth. Genesis 6:5 says every thought of man's heart was only evil continually, which could describe a world ruled by violent oligarchs without check or accountability. Yet this interpretation faces similar challenges as the Sethite view. Why would human political tyranny differ so dramatically from earlier human violence that it alone warrants global judgment? And again, why does Numbers use Nephilim for physical giants if the term originally meant tyrannical rulers? The Hebrew Nephilim remains enigmatic. The root nephal means to fall. This could indicate fallen ones, those who fell from their estate or position. It could mean those who cause others to fall. The fallen angel's interpretation sees these as beings who fell from heaven. The tyrant interpretation sees these as causing others to fall through oppression. But the ancient translations consistently understood physical stature. The Septuagint's gigantes means giants. The Greek translators, working centuries before Christ with access to earlier Hebrew traditions, chose this unambiguous term. The Vulgate follows suit. Ancient Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century, explicitly describes these as giants of massive size and strength. The Numbers 13 passage reinforces this. The spies report, and there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants. And we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. The comparison is physical, not merely about feeling oppressed by tyrants. The Anakim were real people with real settlements. Caleb later defeats them at Hebron. These aren't metaphors. The Book of Enoch, while not canonical for most Christian traditions, was clearly influential in Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity. That Jude quotes it suggests apostolic awareness of its historical relevance. Enoch adds disturbing details. The Watchers taught humans arts that advanced civilization rapidly, but corrupted it morally. The giants consumed resources unsustainably, then turned to cannibalism. God sends the flood specifically to cleanse the earth of these hybrids, while imprisoning the angels who caused this catastrophe. The Book of Jubilees agrees on the basic framework. The Damascus document from the Dead Sea Scrolls references the Watchers' sin. Ancient Jewish tradition was remarkably consistent. Something happened involving angelic beings that corrupted the pre-flood world. But these texts aren't scripture for most Christians, creating interpretive tension. Do we use extra-biblical sources to illuminate unclear passages? Or risk importing non-inspired material into theology? Here the evidence becomes frustratingly sparse. If giants once lived, where are the bones? Human remains from ancient periods exist throughout the archaeological record, yet no confirmed skeletal remains of massive humanoids have been verified by mainstream science. Various reports circulate about giant skeletons discovered in the 19th century, 7-foot, 8-foot, even larger remains. Newspaper accounts occasionally mention such finds, but none have been preserved for modern verification. Photographs allegedly showing massive skulls prove to be hoaxes or misidentified remains. This absence presents a problem for literal interpretations. If Nephilim descendants lived widely enough to appear in Canaan centuries after the flood, skeletal evidence should exist. The counter-argument suggests ancient peoples might have specifically destroyed such remains, viewing them as cursed. Or perhaps the giants weren't as physically enormous as popular imagination suggests, merely unusually tall by ancient standards. Alternatively, the lack of remains could indicate the Nephilim weren't physically giant at all, but rather culturally powerful, though this returns us to why the text emphasizes physical stature. Every ancient culture has giant legends. Greeks had titans. Norse mythology features Jotnar. Sumerian texts mention godlike beings descending to earth. Hindu epics describe Daityas. Native American traditions reference ancient giants. Aztec legends spoke of the Quinametsin, who lived before the present age. Skeptics view these parallels as evidence that giant myths are universal human imagination, perhaps based on discovering large fossilized bones of extinct megafauna. Believers see these widespread legends as cultural memory of real events, dispersed when humanity scattered after Babel. The question becomes, does the universality of giant legends validate or invalidate the Genesis account? If every culture independently invented giant stories, it suggests psychological patterns rather than history. But if these cultures carry fragments of genuine pre-flood history, the consistency becomes evidence. Occam's razor cuts both ways. Is it simpler to believe every ancient culture independently invented similar myths, or that something remarkable actually happened that all cultures remember? Numbers 13 creates a continuity problem. If the flood destroyed all flesh except Noah's family, how do giants appear in Canaan? The text says Nephilim existed in those days and also after that. But does after that mean after the sons of God took wives or after the flood? Several possibilities emerge. Perhaps Noah's sons carried recessive genes producing exceptional size. Perhaps angelic incursion wasn't a one-time event, but repeated after the flood in localized areas. Perhaps Canaanite giants were biologically unrelated to pre-flood Nephilim, but carried the same name. The conquest narratives take these giants seriously. Deuteronomy 2 and 3 mention the Rephaim, Emim, and Zamzummim, all described as peoples of great size. Og's bed specifications suggest a man over 13 feet tall. David's conflict with Goliath and other Philistine giants indicates the phenomenon persisted into Israel's monarchy. 1 Samuel 17:4 gives Goliath's height as 6 cubits and a span, roughly 9 feet 6 inches. His armor weighed 125 pounds. His spear tip alone weighed 15 pounds. These are specific details in historical narrative, not poetic mythology. Either ancient Israel repeatedly encountered exceptionally large humans, or the biblical text records exaggerated legends. But the consistency and specificity argue for something real, something unusual enough to require repeated mention across centuries. Dr. Michael Heiser, a respected biblical scholar, argued forcefully for the angelic interpretation. His research emphasized that ancient readers wouldn't have imposed later philosophical constraints on the text. They took the supernatural elements seriously because their worldview accommodated such realities. Heiser noted that biblical writers existed in a world where Gods, spirits, and divine beings interacting with the physical realm was assumed, not debated. The question wasn't, could this happen? But, what does this mean for God's covenant and humanity's redemption? Traditional theologians like Matthew Henry favored the Sethite interpretation, viewing it as more compatible with human responsibility for sin. The Westminster tradition generally follows this line, emphasizing covenant continuity rather than supernatural interruption. Jewish scholarship remains divided. Maimonides rejected the angelic interpretation as too literal. Nachmanides accepted it, but minimized its implications. Modern Jewish scholars often view the passage through ancient Near Eastern mythology, not as literal history, but as Israel borrowing and subverting neighboring stories about divine human boundary crossing. Archaeological perspectives offer little consensus because physical evidence is limited. No mainstream archaeologist has verified giant remains, leading most to dismiss the literal giant interpretation. However, archaeology has repeatedly validated biblical accounts once thought legendary: the Hittites, Pilate, the House of Peter. Absence of evidence isn't always evidence of absence. Contemporary theologians struggle with the Nephilim in an age uncomfortable with supernatural elements. Liberal scholarship tends to categorize Genesis 1 to 11 as mythological prologue, which sidesteps the question. Conservative scholarship must grapple with affirming Scripture's authority while acknowledging genuine ambiguity. What remains striking is that no interpretation feels entirely satisfying. The angelic view requires accepting realities that stretch modern worldviews. The Sethite view struggles to explain the text's language and subsequent giant references. The tyrant view doesn't account for unique terminology and specific physical descriptions. Perhaps this ambiguity is itself instructive. Perhaps we're meant to wrestle with this text, recognizing that the antediluvian world operated under conditions we can no longer fully comprehend. Imagine the earth in those final generations before the flood. Imagine walking through cities where beings of extraordinary stature move among ordinary humans, offspring of unions that should never have occurred, creatures that blur the boundaries God established at creation. These aren't mere tall people. The text calls them Gibborim, mighty ones, men of renown, warriors whose strength made them legendary, the kind of beings that make normal humans feel like grasshoppers. Now imagine the world they shaped. Violence filled the earth. Every thought of every heart was only evil continually. The corruption wasn't just moral. Something fundamental had been twisted in humanity itself. The image of God, that sacred reflection of the Creator in His creation, had been so thoroughly defaced that only 8 people remained untouched. Whether this corruption was genetic, cultural, or spiritual, or all three, its totality meant civilization itself had become irredeemable, not reformable, not correctable through judgment or teaching, so compromised that starting over with a single faithful family became the only viable option. This is the context of the flood. Not divine overreaction to human sin. There had been human sin since Eden. Not arbitrary anger at human development. Cain built cities generations earlier. This was response to corruption so profound it threatened God's entire plan for redemption. If all flesh had become corrupted, how could the Messiah come through a pure human line? The flood wasn't punishment, it was surgery. Radical traumatic surgery to cut out malignancy before it metastasized beyond any possibility of cure. And yet, the Nephilim, or their echo, reappears in Canaan. Whatever happened before the flood, some remnant survived, which meant Israel's conquest centuries later carried stakes most modern readers miss. Eliminating the giant clans wasn't ethnic cleansing, it was completing the cleansing the flood began. This casts the entire Old Testament conquest narrative in different light. The battles weren't merely for territory, they were final stages of a war that began when the sons of God first looked upon the daughters of men with desire, when boundaries meant to be inviolate were violated, when creation itself was corrupted. The awe isn't just that giants once walked the earth. The awe is that God preserved humanity through it all. That despite catastrophic breach, despite corruption requiring drowning the world, despite remnants that survived to threaten again, the plan of redemption never failed. From Noah to Abraham to David to Christ, the line remained unbroken. The promise held. The Nephilim mystery isn't ultimately about giants. It's about the lengths to which forces opposed to God's purposes will go to corrupt his creation, and the greater lengths to which God will go to preserve it. 3 millennia of scholarship hasn't resolved the Nephilim mystery. Perhaps it can't be resolved with available information. The text gives us fragments, ancient tradition adds details, but the full picture remains obscured by the distance of ages and the flood's catastrophic discontinuity. What we can say with confidence: Genesis 6 describes something extraordinary. Whether fallen angels taking human wives, corruption through unchecked violence, or something else, the passage marks a crisis so severe that only total judgment could address it. The ancient world took giants seriously. From Genesis through Samuel, references to beings of exceptional size persist in texts treating them as historical reality, not poetic metaphor. New Testament authors found pre-flood events theologically significant. Peter and Jude both reference them when discussing judgment, rebellion, and boundaries between spiritual and physical realms. Archaeology has neither proven nor disproven literal Nephilim existence. Absence of confirmed giant remains argues against extreme physical interpretations, but doesn't eliminate the possibility of unusually large humans or explain consistent textual references. What we cannot say is exactly what happened. We cannot reconstruct the mechanics of divine-human interaction in the antediluvian world. We cannot fully explain how or why giants appear in Canaan if the flood destroyed everything. We cannot resolve why God allowed such corruption or why it required such drastic response. And perhaps that's acceptable. Mystery is part of the point. The Bible doesn't explain everything. It reveals what we need for faith and salvation, but doesn't satisfy every curiosity. The Nephilim remain enigmatic because the full story isn't ours to know, at least not yet. What matters more than solving the mystery is recognizing what it reveals about the biblical worldview. Scripture presents a reality where spiritual and physical realms interact, where cosmic forces oppose God's purposes, where corruption can become so total that only catastrophic judgment can cleanse it, and where God preserves his plan despite every obstacle. The Nephilim narrative reminds us that the world before us was stranger than we imagine, that Scripture contains depths we've barely plumbed, and that faithful interpretation requires holding together reverence for the text with intellectual honesty about what we understand and what remains mysterious. Whether giants literally walked the earth or the truth is more complex, one thing is certain: Genesis 6 marks a turning point in human history. After the Nephilim comes the flood. After the flood comes a new beginning, one man, one family, one ark preserving humanity to continue the story God had written before the foundations of the world. The mystery endures, but so does the promise. If this exploration into the ancient unknown stirred your spirit, ensure you subscribe to the Convergent Script for more journeys into the sacred mysteries that shaped our faith. We don't offer easy answers. We offer honest engagement with Scripture's most challenging passages. Share your thoughts below. What do you believe about the Nephilim? Were they fallen angels' offspring, exceptionally large humans, powerful tyrants whose violence filled the earth? Or something else entirely that the text hints at but doesn't fully reveal? More importantly, how does this passage change how you read the Genesis narrative? How does it affect your understanding of the flood, of spiritual warfare, of God's judgment and preservation? The conversation doesn't end here. It begins here. Subscribe, comment, and join us as we continue exploring where Scripture, history, and mystery converge.